Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Paul Johnson as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Paul Johnson currently serves as the Provost of the Queen's College, University of Oxford. Paul Johnson served as the Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies from 2011 to 2025 before becoming Provost of the Queen's College. He writes as a columnist for The Times and frequently contributes across broadcast and print media. Alongside his public commentary, he is a visiting professor in the UCL Policy Lab and the UCL Department of Economics, and he also served as a senior advisor to Public First, an economics, policy, and opinion research consultancy. His 2023 book, Follow the Money, became the Sunday Times bestseller. Paul has also built a strong audio footprint, hosting the podcast The IFS Zooms In, which reach up to 1 lakh downloads per episode, and co-hosting The Expert Factor. Over the past decade, he has held several major public service and advisory roles, including 11 years as a member of the UK Climate Change Committee and positions on the councils of the ESRC and the Royal Economic Society. He has held multiple high-profile reviews for government covering pension, auto-enrollment, and inflation measurement for the UK government, and the fiscal devolution for the Northern Ireland Executive. Earlier in his career, Paul was chief economist at the Department for Education and served at HM Treasury as Director of Public Spending, where he also acted as Deputy Head of the Government Economic Service. He was educated at King's Minor Community College, Keble College, Oxford, and Birkbeck College, London. He was appointed CBE in the 2018 birthday honours for services to the social sciences and economics. He holds honorary doctorates from UCL and the Universities of Exeter, Sussex, and York, and is an honorary fellow of Keble College, Oxford. In today's episode, Paul Johnson discusses key insights from his acclaimed book, Challenging Inequalities, How We Go Stuck and Where We Go Next. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Please join me in welcoming Paul Johnson. Paul, thank you for joining us. It's truly an honor to have you on Businesstalk today.
Well, thank you.
Paul, in the book, you link the feeling that progress has stalled to inequality. What's the clearest evidence that inequality is a driver rather than just a symptom of stagnation?
I think it is the way in which we experience inequality is a significant symptom of the stagnation that we, certainly in the UK and across much of Western Europe in particular, have suffered really since the financial crisis of 2008. So that crisis hit a country like the UK at a period when inequality of incomes and earnings was very high. But what's happened since 2008 is actually, if anything, those income and earnings inequalities have reduced somewhat, but people still see inequality as a big issue. And part of the reason there is that concern has moved from things like income and earnings to things like wealth, political voice, regional inequality, and a whole series of other things. And part of what's going on there, several things going on there. One is that it's very hard now to earn your way up the wealth distribution because wealth has become bigger and more important and earnings have stagnated. Social mobility has gone backwards because it matters more, the wealth and background of your parents. And of course, when things aren't getting better, when incomes aren't rising, politics becomes a zero-sum game. Anyone getting better off means other people getting worse off because there's no more money to go around. And that's created some of the issues in our politics that we've seen, in my view, over the last several years. So what's really happening, I think, is that our ideas of what matters in terms of inequality have changed as economic growth has stalled, and it's become much more salient when people aren't seeing themselves getting better off. And certainly there's some evidence that people are less concerned about inequality or even growing inequality if they themselves are getting somewhat better off. Whereas in a world in which they're not getting any better off, then the inequality that exists become much more salient for them.
You broaden inequality beyond income and wealth to health, opportunity, and political participation. Which of these gaps is most underestimated in public debate and why?
It's interesting. I mean, some of those are part of public debate. So income and wealth inequality in particular, people talk about a lot, and actually wealth inequality more than in the past. And I think that reflects the fact that it's become more important, and also the wealth of some of the sort of tech billionaires and so on has become more evident to people. When people see health inequality, it's something they become very, very concerned about, but it's not something that is really part of the everyday sort of political discussion, despite the fact that, in my view, inequalities in life expectancy almost are the sort of end point of all of the other inequalities that we see. I mean, we know that one's experience over one's whole life really impact on one's health trajectory and the point at which one, in the end, dies. And there's a very strong correlation between education, social class, wealth, on the one hand, and your health and your longevity, your life expectancy on the other. Actually, the thing that seems to concern people most in the UK actually is inequality between areas or regions. I mean, we are very unusual in having one very sort of well-off part of the country, London, and some of the areas around it, and no other really well-off parts, certainly by international standards. One of the things we do in the book is look at how that's changed over time. If you look 60, 70 years ago, for example, you see many parts of the UK in the top few in terms of wealthy parts of Europe. You really now only see London, and all of the other regions of the UK are some considerable way down that league table. And compared again with other European countries, we have just the one wealthy or rich or thriving area, whereas most other significant countries have several points of particularly high wealth.
Paul, you argue the post-2008 stagnation exposed inequalities that originated in the 1980s. What policy or market shift from that era still shape outcomes most strongly today?
Well, in the 1980s in the UK, the economy changed really dramatically. We lost a lot of our manufacturing industry and heavy industry. We had a very high level of unemployment in some areas, and actually income inequality and earnings inequality grew very, very fast in the 1980s. Now, the point is, in a sense, that people, or a lot of people, were less concerned about that over a period when everybody's incomes, or most people's incomes, were rising. And that impact has pushed on down the generations. So one of the reasons for the high levels of regional inequality is that those economic changes in the 1980s hit some regions much harder than others. And you also see, I mean, you can actually see that the children of people who were affected in that time are, again, following in their parents' footsteps. So if you are the child of someone who was struggling and in a struggling region, you're going to be doing much, much less well than if you're the child of someone who was doing well in a thriving region. It's also solidified some of those wealth inequalities. So the cost of housing, for example, is dramatically different in different parts of the country. And that makes it very difficult for people to move from one part to another. So I think the consequences of the 1980s we've really seen in the last 10, 20 years. As I say, incomes have stagnated, but we have a combination, horrible combination of stagnation with high levels of inequality. Now, inequality of income has not grown in the last 20 years. If anything, it's fallen, but it's still at a high level. And that stagnation has exacerbated, I think, the sense of some people feeling significantly left behind.
Early life experiences and education reoccur as a root causes. If you could redesign one early years lever, like childcare, schools, health, or parenting support, what would you prioritize and how would you measure success?
Well, it's a very difficult one to offer a single priority, but you're absolutely right. I mean, we know that there's a very strong correlation between your experience as a child, your family background, your education, and what comes later in life. Now, the education system can clearly do something about that, and indeed, schools are undoubtedly important in reducing inequalities, as is early as our early interventions. But what the state, I don't think, can or should try to do is get too involved in what families are doing. And families clearly are very different, and families from different backgrounds have very different engagement with their children, and all of that is related to their final outcomes. So I don't think there is a single answer to your question. I think the important thing is to follow through certainly life up to the end of school, up to 18, with policies that support those from less well-off backgrounds. Now, my take on the data in the UK is that things particularly start to go wrong here in possibly the sort of ages 14, 15 to 19, for those groups of young people who are not thriving in school. We actually astonishingly don't have a route for them. I mean, we have one set of exams that you can take at age 16, and a significant fraction of young people fail those, and they know they're going to fail them, and they have no other option but to take them. And in particular, we have no clear route post 16 for young people who want to do vocational education, who want to get into trades and things like that. It's very, very complex. It's poorly funded. It's poorly organized. And it does mean that for at least the majority of those who go on to university, they do okay, although even that's changing. But for a majority of those who don't, they can often struggle for some considerable period of time. So I would focus, if I had to focus somewhere, I'd focus on that sort of 15 to 19 age group, and really on the education that we offer across the period.
All employment and earning trends have shifted over decades. What changes in job quality, like security, bargaining power, progression, matter as much as wages, but get less attention?
Yeah, it's certainly the case that things way beyond wages matter to people. So if you look at surveys, people say that they care about things like progression, things like having a voice in the workplace, things like flexibility, all of those sorts of things. Now, all of those are highly correlated with your education and with your earnings and so on, but they're very much not the same thing. And many of the things that people like me in a professional sort of role take for granted, yeah, particularly in terms of flexibility and control, many people in in other positions don't have that. I mean, how to achieve that is quite hard. I mean, we know this is something that people really care about. But if you take progression, for example, we know that people with different levels of education, they start on different salaries. But what really happens is through life, people with higher levels of education progress, and those with lower level progression of education find it much harder to progress. So we need to think about ways of enhancing progression. There's a real issue often for women, and particularly for mothers, that after they've had children, they often stop all wage progression, and that's clearly an issue in the labour market that needs addressing. We see big differences again between the sorts of jobs that are available in different parts of the country, and increasingly firms that are outsourcing some roles then make it difficult to progress within the firm or to share good practice across different roles. Now, I don't have any answers to how to make a big difference there, but these are sorts of issues which actually, frankly, economists such as myself often neglect when we're just looking at, as it were, cross-section snapshots of wages.
You describe stall progress on health inequalities. What are the most possible mechanisms connecting economic inequality to health outcomes in a high income country like UK?
Yeah, it's very striking. I mean, health inequalities have really sort of followed, in some sense, or at least the stagnation has followed what's happened to income inequality or incomes. So, if you look at the overall health statistics, particularly longevity, it grew very fast up to about 2010, and then slowed to almost nothing since 2010 in terms of improvements. Now, that suggests at least a relationship between economic progress and progress in health. If you look at the inequalities, I mean, there seem to be there's a number of things that appear to relate economic inequalities to health inequalities. So people from less well-off backgrounds tend to have less healthy childhoods. Their parents might to smoke during pregnancy. They're more likely to suffer stress during early childhood, and we know that that relates to poorer health later on. When they get into the workplace, they maybe have less, as I was saying earlier, less control over what they're doing, and that can relate to stress, which again can be bad for health later on. May well be in a less pleasant, less healthy workplace environment. And then there are obviously the opportunities to, which seems much less important actually in the UK, the opportunity to access healthcare with a national health service. That doesn't seem to be a big driver of it. It appears to be down to people's life experiences, the stress that they face, and the environment that they're living in, their childhood experiences. All of those sorts of things come together to create stresses on the mind and body for those from poorer backgrounds relative to better off. Now, obviously, there's huge variation with this. There are lots of poorer people who live a long time and lots of richer people who die earlier. But on average, the gap, particularly in longevity, is very substantial, as is the gap in healthy life expectancy. If you look by income or social class or education or the local or how well off your local area is, these gaps are very, very big.
On inequalities across gender, ethnicity, geography, age, and education, where do you see the most harmful intersections? Example, region plus education. And what policy response matches that complexity?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of complexity across those areas. So, I mean, take ethnicity for example. So the UK is very unusual in the Western world in that ethnic minority groups pretty much all do better in education than the white majority, and in particular, poorer ethnic minority groups do much better than poorer white kids. Now, part of that, at least, is that there's a combination of a lot of ethnic minority groups in London and a much better education system in London. So you put those two things together, and ethnic minority groups from London do very well. And there's one group who does less well. That's Afro-Caribbeans. But Indians, Chinese do staggeringly better than everybody else. But even those groups which have historically done less well, like Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Black Africans, are doing at least as well and in general better. And that's partly related to geography. If you look at gender and social class, again, white working class boys do atrociously badly in education. Girls do somewhat better, but then you look into the labour market, and actually the boys, the men, are doing better than the women. So there's a complex relationship between the sort of class, gender, education, and then what happens in the labour market. If you're looking at regions, again, everyone pretty much does better in London than they do elsewhere. But it's it can be quite localized that people in wealthier parts of some parts of the country do rather better. But really, if you want to do well, you need to be in London, irrespective of anything else in those descriptives in terms of your characteristics.
Paul, you note that when earnings inequality meets stagnation, wealth becomes more important. What are the biggest channels, housing, inheritances, asset return, through which wealth starts to dominate life chances?
Well, I mean, certainly when you're looking at sort of social mobility or the relationship between a child's outcomes and their parents' outcomes, wealth is really important. So we know that people with wealthy parents are much more likely to get help in terms of moving onto the housing ladder, which in the UK is a real issue. You can one of the aspects that we see in terms of intergenerational inequality is that the older generation is doing so much better than the younger generation, again because they've had that time to accumulate wealth. Often they're more likely to be homeowners. They've got substantial savings and pensions and so on. So again, they're able to help those people in their own families, but not beyond that, because actually tax, whilst wealth has something like doubled relative to national income in the last 30 years, taxes on wealth haven't changed at all as a fraction of national income over that time. So you're able to help your own family, but on the whole, you're not helping the broader community. We know that inheritances are much more important, for example, for people, or will be much more important for people born in the 1980s than for people born in the 1960s. And the crucial thing, in a way, is that whilst wealth inequality hasn't actually changed, if you think of inequality as a ratio, a sort of person at the 90th, the ratio of the sort of richest person to the person in the middle hasn't really changed in the last 50 years. But because the level of wealth has got so much higher, it's much harder for the person in the middle to save their way up, to earn enough to move up the distribution. And that is ossifying sort of social structure, so that those who have wealth are much more likely to maintain their position, and those who don't find it much harder to move up. One thing that's very striking, if you look at home ownership levels of people in their 30s today compared with, say, 30 years ago, for the poorest groups, they're very low today as they were 30 years ago. For the richer groups, they're pretty high today as they were 30 years ago. For people in the middle of the earnings distribution, they're way lower today than they were 30 years ago. And again, I think that has political consequences. So people in the middle feel more like poorer groups, whereas 30 years ago, they'd have felt more like richer groups because they would have been on the home ownership ladder.
The book highlights growing economic power concentrated in an older generation and declining social mobility. What would be a fair intergenerational settlement look like in practice, like taxes, housing, pensions, and education funding?
Yeah, really interesting question. I mean, for me, the first answer to that is we simply need to build more houses. And the UK has failed dramatically to build enough houses for a very long period of time. And that, of course, in some sense, is economically helpful to people who already own a house, and economically quite damaging for those who don't. There's also a whole series of tax issues in the way that we tax housing, which is just disastrously bad. So we need to sort out the housing system for sure. Another thing that's very striking is if you look at education spending, you mentioned that, we spend today about the same fraction of national income on education as we did 40 or 50 years ago. We spend, and back in the 1980s, we spent about the same on health as we do on education. We now spend way more than twice as much on health as we do on education. Of course, most of that spending on health goes towards older people. So that tells us something about the priorities that we've put on health relative to education, and as it were, helping older people who need the health care relative to younger people who benefit from the education. So I think that is telling you something about our priorities, as is the generosity of our pension system relative to our working age welfare system. So there are things we can do on the tax system. We unquestionably undertax older people relative to younger people. So if you're overstate pension age, you pay a much lower rate of tax on your earnings than if you're understate pension age, and a much lower rate of tax on your pension income than you do on your earnings. So all of that benefits an older generation, and all of that could be changed. What's much harder, I think, to do is really significantly alter that wealth balance between the generations. It's quite hard to tax inheritances effectively, for example. And it's quite hard to tax accumulated wealth in a way that's both practical and politically feasible. But there are undoubtedly things that we could do to begin to redress that balance.
Paul, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. You connect inequality to regional divergence and political power. What reforms could reduce inequality of political voice without becoming partisan, campaign finance, local devolution, civic participation, or something else?
Well, I think certainly the regional devolution is something that I think there's increasingly convincing evidence that that could really help. It's not, you can't prove it, but I think there's increasingly good evidence that the UK is a very, very centralized country, has very weak regional governance. And that probably helps maintain some of the regional inequalities that we've been talking about. Now, making those changes would take a long time to have an effect, but I think in the long run, it could help both with that political voice and with the economic inequalities. In terms of political voice, it is very striking again that your likelihood of simply voting just goes up as your education goes up, as your wealth goes up, all of those sorts of things. Though voting patterns have changed very substantially again over the last 30 or 40 years, driven increasingly by sort of cultural issues more than they are by economic issues. But it's certainly the case that people with, again, lower levels of education, lower levels of economic advantage are those who are least likely to be engaged in the political process. And that creates its own problems within the political process. Again, absolutely exacerbated by this lack of progress over such a long period of time, which means everyone sees it makes that just makes politics really hard because politicians are working with a fixed sum of money. Pressure on public services continues to grow, particularly again on things like health and pensions. Everyone starts to feel worse off. Or many people start to feel worse off, and that creates dissatisfaction. So I think all of these things they're very closely linked, and so you need to deal with them all together. And again, that's a really tough thing to do.
Paul, thank you for joining us and for such a thoughtful discussion. Your insights on why stalled progress connect to inequality across income and wealth, health, opportunity, and political voice were especially valuable, as were your reflections on early life influences, changing work, wealth concentration, and regional and intergenerational gaps. We are grateful for your time and for challenging inequalities. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We will share the book purchase link and additional resources in the YouTube description. Paul, thank you once again for joining us, and we look forward to welcome you back soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.